So they say the best is always saved for the last. That was amazing, particularly the Mool Mantar. That was probably the exquisite translation, but to bring it to yourself made it so very, very powerful. I know we're going to take some questions from the audience, and I see there are 2 mics put up there. But before we do that, I just want to, I have a couple of questions or comments or suggestions, something for our panel to discuss while you form your questions, and then if you could go at the back, it would save us time, the ones who want to ask questions, it would save us time, instead of handing the microphones to each one of you, right? So, Inderpal raised some very, very important questions. She asked the question, who makes the community? That's something we need to think about. Who makes the community and who speaks for us? What is the voice that speaks for us? That is something which we really need to think about. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. She also said, she talked a lot about, Inderpal, you talked a lot about 1984 and about the violence and how Sikh women are. And I think from the little bit of study that I have done, and very little, it was in 47. In 47, when the women were jumped in wells, that was the first time that happened in Punjab, in Sikh thought, is when the women during the partition were jumping into wells, and it was accepted. It was the way to go. It was honor, whatever else you could think about. But I want to relate something to you, and it's totally unrelated, but I don't know why I feel like sharing this with you. In 84, when it was in 85, June of 85, I was hiding behind, in a Hindu home, behind with my grandmother in a corner in front of a Godrej cupboard. And my grandmother was reciting, my nanny was reciting her part. And all she said to me was, and I was 27 years old, and she said to me, "O darwaza khulega na?" When that door opens, "Pehla chaku, e chaku dekh." She, from her handbag, she pulled out this huge knife. And she said, "Pehle main tenu marangi," I will kill you first, and then I will kill myself. It was that simple. Now, at 27, I did not have the presence of mind or the whatever it was to question her. It was just understood. How does that understanding come about? So when scholars write, well, these women were pushed, or whether their men made them do it, or whatever else they say, talk to somebody who was there, who did not, and it was not a man, it was her grandmother, someone who loved her deeply. And it was so simple. The clarity was so simple, and here, this was a clarity here. I accept, not knowing anything. I have a daughter too. I don't know whether I would do the same thing. I don't know. But for my grandmother, it was very clear. So, living history and what scholars think, because we don't share it. If we want scholars to tell our stories, we have to trust them. That trust is what it is. That you trust us to listen to what we are saying and what it is. And maybe there were a whole lot of women that were pushed. And maybe they're right. But there were also a whole lot that did it on their own. Or who had no choice, who had no thought on that. We mentioned, as Guru as the first Sikh feminist, and, I don't like to go there because Guru was whatever. I don't speak on behalf. But for me, I was told when I was speaking to Malika, like, what am I going to say, what it is? And I said, and I was talking about Bhai Singh. And she said, you know what? In the last conference, there was a panel, and the woman said, there was a speaker who said, in her mind, the greatest Sikh feminist, and she put up the photograph of Bhai Singh. And I said, that's exactly how I feel. This man wrote poetry and thought in a female voice. His poetry and the way he felt for a woman was so exquisite. And if you ever get a chance to read the essay which he wrote before the translation of his Vyakhya of Lamas, it will be mind-blowing. He writes what a woman's place was in society then. He writes what the Padshah has done by elevating it. He's put it in context. And then you realize what it was. He writes there one line, Aurat Mard di jutti to vi thalle sigi, that she was a soul. It was something which I could not understand. What does that mean? Because it's Punjabi culture. What does that mean? Bring it to my understanding, to my reality today. And my aunt explained to me, she said, Beta, what happened? Jutti you take with you to places, you wear it, but then you leave it outside. So you're never taken into the important meetings, right? You're left outside. But you're there, you're visible. But what is the soul? The thalle. It's you use it, you don't see it, you discard it. And you replace it. This is what Padshah was saying. And this is what Bhai Veer Singh felt so deeply to explain to us what it was that Padshah has done in the Lamas. And we've missed that out. So my question is, how can we miss that out? When Bani is so ingrained in us, we live, breathe, whatever it is, in us I mean gender, male, female, doesn't matter. How come it is not translating? And that's where Nikki says, listening, understanding, and application. The application part is where we are at. And Palminder says, celebrating. You know, when she was talking, all I was saying is, why are we looking at ourselves as victims? Why don't we celebrate? That celebration hasn't come in us. You know, that joy of being just a woman. That if a Nihang can ride on a horseback with the wind on his face, so can a woman. I feel it. I am a Nihang. I am riding, but except it's different. It's my music. It is my poetry. It is my art. But I feel that freedom, and that freedom has come from Bani. So before we go in, I know Palminder talked about feminism, what it means to all of us. In simple language, simple words, 2 minutes, if each of our panelists could tell us what it means to them. So we are all on the same page, and then we'll take the questions from the audience. Yeah?
No, I'm just going to speak from here. I think it's,
you want to?
it's small enough. Can you hear me?
Yeah, live stream.
I just want to say a couple of things in response to some of the wonderful questions Inni has raised. One about the kind of work that I've focused on a little bit about academia and scholarly work and their separation from the community. The questions that you raised, Inni, about sort of why did your Nani was say what she did, you know, there's a tremendous amount of work done by scholars talking to people. That's what they do. They go talk to the community. They may not have spoken to everyone, but they do snowball samples. Anthropologists will talk to hundreds of people. The first people who went after 1984 into Trilokpuri also included a ton of feminist scholars from Delhi itself. Uma Chakravarti, Veena Das, a whole bunch of people went and questioned what had happened. They took testimonies. They talked to people. They got all kinds of information from them. And they were the people who were going against the official narratives of what was going on. They were saying, no, there's something else going on. So they're very brave journalists. There were a ton of committed feminists committed to civil liberties who went in to ask these questions, right? So scholarship is not sort of this separate world. Scholarship is based on talking to people, on looking at the documents, talking to people, doing surveys, doing quantitative analysis, qualitative analysis, oral histories, everything. So, it is sort of part of the world. But at the same time, scholars come from the communities too, right? We all live in culture, which means why your Nani said what she did was a question that many, many feminists talk about all the time, how gender works in society. This is the way it works. You internalize. Michel Foucault said the greatest power you have is when you internalize power. When it comes from within you and you think it comes from outside, that's how power works, right? So when she would say that, it means she was a gendered person in society, right? At that time, the question about what the Bani says was not in her mind. She could not go to the interpretations of the Bani that we are now doing. Feminist interpretations, reinterpretations, as we are bringing the Bani into culture. She could not do that at that point. At that point, the resonances of 47, you say it very well, the resonances of culture, of ideas of femininity, of ideas of honor, everything else, were simply emerged full-blown, right, in her. And that's how gender is power in everyday life. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And so to me, as a feminist, that's what I spend my time thinking about. Why do people do what they do? How does power work? What is politics? And to me, as a feminist, as a Sikh feminist, one of the things I do is precisely question things like, you brought up sex selection. Well, how does it matter? What happens? It's not that the women are not educated who are doing it. Actually, it's found, the research finds that it's middle-class educated women and men who do sex selection. Poor people often cannot afford the tests. It's middle-class people who do it. And these are educated people. So what are we doing wrong? So the question we then have to ask, what is that education? Why aren't they thinking about what the negative aspects of this are? So, just to think about culture and power is what I do as a feminist.
What did you want us to define feminism? Feminism for me is to be treated equally with the other gender, no more, no less. That's it. But I do want to reinforce what Indipal just said. And that's what I feel. When I read Bani, it's extremely liberal, radical, very open-minded. But over the years, scholarship has gone on in the Sikh tradition. And what have the scholars and exegetes done? I don't think they were as open-minded as the gurus. So the version that we have gotten, that we've been fed on for centuries and centuries, has been through those patriarchal lenses. So we need to get back to our text ourselves, men and women, young and old, equally. And we need to read the text. That's what I want to emphasize. Thank you.
Okay, well, what it means to turn this on.
You want to use mine?
Here we go. Sorry. I've talked about my definition of feminism, but I wanted to just pick up on a little comment that Nikki just made, because that writing, that literature that's out there, and the interpretation of Sikhi has predominantly come from a male perspective. How does that affect us as women? It's very simple. When I started doing human rights work with WSO almost 30 years ago, 20 years or 25 years ago, one of the very foremost challenges that I faced was that all of the literature that explained to non-Sikhs about Sikhism was always written from the perspective of a male, of a sardar, of a man who wears a turban and who has all these issues that have to be accommodated or addressed or dealt with. And so the very first thing that we did at WSO right from the outset was to create our own literature from a feminine voice. So every single time we made submissions, whether those were to transport boards, whether they were to hospital boards, policing, every single time we made submissions, we made sure that each of those pieces of literature incorporated women as being Sikhs, because the Sikh identity was always referenced as a male identity. And so writing from the feminine voice, making sure that the literature was she, writing from that feminine voice was important because it allowed people who visualized a Sikh as a turbaned man to understand that there were women that may or may not wear turbans, that may wear scarves, that may not even wear a rumal, but may not cut their hair, that had all of these other variations of their practices that were critical towards being accommodated. So I think that rewriting, that reinterpreting from that feminine voice is very important, because it allows us to be able to solve problems that later on, relying on the literature that existed, meant that accommodations would only be male-specific. And I saw that in some situations where we ended up having to literally face people that said, well, yes, we've accommodated the turban, but women don't wear turbans, so we don't really need to accommodate that. And so women having to actually go forward, no, this is actually, my own spiritual belief and a requirement in my own interpretation of Sikhi as well for a woman. And so having to open that door further when, frankly, our brothers should never have closed it on us in the first place.